Revelation 13, verses 15 through 17. He, speaking of the beast's power, was permitted to give a spirit to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could both speak and cause whoever would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And he requires everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be given a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he has the mark, the beast's name, or the number of his name. May God add a blessing to the reading of his word.
Good morning, everyone. I've known Aaron for a long time. He's my brother from another mother, I'm always excited that I can have an opportunity to share some of the thoughts that the Lord has put on my heart over the years. Actually, I wrote most of this for 4th of July. I was supposed to speak here on the 4th of July, and then the schedule all got so it's deals with a lot of. I'm going to be talking a lot about freedom, and the values of freedom and those kind of things. But mostly, I want to talk today about the spirit of Antichrist. So, what is it like? How do we identify it? How we might even have that same spirit ourselves. We've all learned who the beast is and what the mark of the beast is, and that can be good, but there are some potentially important ways that learning this could be harmful to us. So one of the worst parts about learning things as an adult is that we know how to pay attention. It's actually a hindrance to learning, being able to pay attention. I used to be a university professor. I taught English as a second language, and there was a big difference between people who learned a language before puberty and the people who learned it afterward. And one of the biggest problems is that as an adult, you can pay attention. You can sit through a boring grammar lesson and you don't have to be entertained. Whereas with children, you have to pretty much entertain them every 5 or 10 minutes. You got to do something different or exciting because they're going to lose focus. So kids can't pay attention. So by default, they're paying attention to everything. I've had to teach lessons about dry lessons that it's very hard to make them exciting. On subject-verb agreement, stative versus active verbs, or dynamic verbs, the varying rules on when to use the, or nothing at all. What's the difference between he committed a crime, which is a crime that I know about prior to this conversation, but to you, that's the first time you've heard about it. He committed a crime. You maybe didn't realize that's why you use but it's when I know something that you don't. So there's a lot that's conveyed in that little letter, versus he committed the crime, which means it's a specific crime that I know about and you know about prior to me saying that. So that's the difference between and the. You already know how to do this if you're a native speaker, but versus the city has a serious problem with crime. No the, meaning crime in general, not a specific crime done by anyone. It takes weeks for students to learn the basics of when to use one or the other, and while the adult learners can sit still and quietly take notes and engage in specific activities where they have to speak or write using the correct structure, these lessons would be impossible to teach to children. They're just way too boring, trying to get children to sit through it. Yet every adult learner, after weeks and weeks of lectures, activities, quizzes, exams, still say ridiculous things like, the city has a serious problem with the crime. And you're like, nope, not the crime. You got to say crime. Or they would say something like, he committed crime. No, he committed a crime. It has to be a specific crime. You can't just say he committed crime in general. These are things that, like, as a native speaker, we all do flawlessly. Why? Because we learned as children. Children learn by default because they can't pay attention to anything. So by default, they're paying attention to everything. I'm sure the parents in here would bear that out. There's things that your kids have repeated that you're like, I didn't know that they were listening. I had a job once with a coworker. Let's just say I'll protect the coworker, even though I really hated his guts. Let's just say his name was Johnny, and one time I was always complaining because he was making mistakes a lot that really bothered me. One day, I think Charlie was only like 2.5 or 3, and he says, "Does Johnny make a lot of steaks?" And I was like, "What do you mean, steaks?" He's like, "Yeah, steaks. He's always making steaks, isn't he?" And I go, "Oh, he knows that I'm talking about Johnny and his mistakes. That he's making it." I'd come home from work complaining about this person. I didn't even realize, he's such a little guy at that time. 2.5, 3, he could barely talk. But yeah, he was paying attention enough. So children remember these things. And none of you probably remember when did you learn the difference between the, and when to use no or the. You don't even remember that because you learned it so long ago. So it turns out paying attention results in incomplete learning. The adults are so focused on performing well, getting their point across, on being understood, and because of this, there are a lot of little details that they're ignoring because, you could say, you give fork, and people would understand what you meant. It sounds a little like a caveman, but everyone would know what you meant, if you said, you give fork. So you could get your job done communication-wise, and you'd get what you want. And so you can survive without these little details that are important details. When you say he committed the crime, you're like, what crime? I should know about this. You're saying so you know that I know that you know about this thing because I'm using the there. Anyway, they've done experiments that bear this out. They gave children and adults flashcards, and on the cards they had a household object and they had an animal. And they were told that they had to memorize which object came with which animal. Okay? So if it was a horse, did the horse appear next to a table or did it appear next to a lamp? Did the dog appear next to a chair or was he next to a couch? So they had adults and children memorize it. And adults and children performed the same. Then they asked a surprise question. Where was the dog in relation to the table? Where was the cat in relation to the lamp? And guess who did better? The children. The children were paying attention somehow and the children go, oh, the dog was under the table, whereas the adults were so focused on, okay, which animal goes with which object, then they just sort of phased out all the other stuff because the other stuff wasn't important because they were told focus, and adults can focus. So that's when we pay attention, we ignore. So could it be possible that there's something about the beast power that we've ignored because we were focused on one aspect of the beast? Maybe who is the beast and what is the identity of the beast in prophecy? So we focus on that, and we read that he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause many as would not worship the beast, the image of the beast, should be killed. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark on their right hand or in their foreheads. And that no man might buy or sell, save he had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. So the beast has the following characteristics. So, we know that it speaks great things and blasphemies. And blasphemy, according to the Bible, is falsely claiming the authority of God. So we know blasphemy is equating yourself with God. We narrowly define this as assuming authority to forgive. Jesus was accused of blasphemy when he forgave a man's sins in Luke 5:21. His critics claiming that he did not have the authority to do this. Jesus did have the authority to forgive. But claiming you have authority to do something that you don't is actually some kind of hypocrisy. It's a false forgiveness. It has an element of apparent benevolence and compassion attached to it, but it's false. So Jesus was accused of blasphemy in Mark 14:64 for saying he would be seen coming in the clouds of heaven. In John 10:33, they accused him of making himself God. It seems blasphemy to take the position of God as an ultimate and infallible authority over someone else. This is supported by the fact that the beast wears many crowns. It's something that in America we've rebelled against, the kind of kingly authority of monarchs and other despots over the sovereign individual. So the second trait, so the first trait is the beast is blasphemous. It has a kind of false authority that doesn't actually have the authority to do what it wants and say. It also has two horns like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. And this is a really strange contradiction. So Jesus is the lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world. So the beast has an outer appearance of being like Jesus, but it talks like Satan. the dragon who deceives the whole world. So we've traditionally identified this as a government power rising to prominence in 1798. But beyond the literal, the beast will appear as something Christian, just in principle, if you follow me. It will appear as something Christian, but it will have a satanic influence. Since our words are our influence, the way that we influence the world around us. This harkened back to, as well, to Judas, who he had the appearance of an apostle, but he was actually under the influence of Satan. So we're considered to be ministers of reconciliation in 2 Corinthians 5:18, right? So we're even, so Judas is a false minister. And it should not be surprising that there's only 2 times in the Bible that they refer to the son of perdition, one to the Antichrist, and the other is to Judas. So John 17:1, and then secondly to the Antichrist in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. So there's an element of hypocrisy, of acting, and fake authority. The third trait would be that the beast uses force and fear to get people to worship the first beast. So, and we read that in the text, so can't buy or sell. You must receive the mark or you should die. It's definitely a power that operates out of fear, fear and coercion. So people must worship the beast or be killed. They have to receive the mark in their right hand or to carry out what the beast wants, or in their forehead, meaning believe what the beast wants. The beast does not care if you believe it internally, so long as you comply outwardly, which is a common idea in satanic thought when you think about it. If you read through the Gospels, Satan wants to manipulate people's outside behaviors and get them to break the commandments. We become slowly twisted into something worse, and we find ourselves more and more at odds with God, our family, and our friends. So without the mark, you can't buy or sell. You can't get what you need, or your livelihood is threatened. That's Satan's methods, whereas Jesus works from the inside out. He wants to change our heart, and our heart eventually affects our behaviors on the outside. But Satan wants to work on the outside in. Change your behaviors, corrupt your soul. Satan does not care if you believe that what you're doing is wrong. He just wants you to do the wrong thing, and eventually that will have a corrupting influence on that. Satan's laws, the laws of man exist for power in a lot of ways. So unlike Christ, who voluntarily stepped down from his throne, and he went into a sin-polluted world, Satan sought to usurp God and seize his throne through deception and force. So Satan loves control, fear, manipulation, which is the opposite of God's system. Jesus stepped down voluntarily. He had the power of God. He did not have to step down, but he chose to step down into the world and become a man. When you are keeping God's laws, you are operating in harmony with the universe, the way that God designed it to be. Consider just the first 4 commandments, the first and second. When you worship something other than God, the ultimate standard of good, when you worship God, who is the ultimate standard of good, you endeavor to be more like that. When you worship things like money, fame, the approval of others, safety, you become corrupt, shallow, fake, and cowardly. The third commandment, when you take God's name and you hold to it and act according to it, your life remains stable, your aim ennobles you and makes you better. People admire and respect you and are almost drawn to you. You've probably had times in your life where someone was like, you're just a really kind person, and I love that about you. They notice something is different about you. When you claim to be a Christian, but then all people see from you is hypocrisy, falsehood, bitterness, resentment, they feel kind of repulsed by you, and they don't know your God for themselves, so they blaspheme God and they mock your faith. So, and that's actually what God said, that others would blaspheme his name because of hypocrisy and because of falsely claiming God's name. When you keep Sabbath and rest, you recuperate your physical energy, and in the peace and quiet of the day, you get to reconnect with your family. There's a kind of balance to your life. When you work 7 days a week, your life becomes unbalanced. You become physically worn out. You lose touch with your family and friends. Are your family and friends just arbitrarily falling out of touch with you? They're just like, no, it's the fact that you're just not showing up. You're so busy with your work that you have no time for your family. So there's three traits. So Satan works from the outside in because he wants power. God works from the inside out because he wants authenticity. He wants love, and he wants genuine maturity. It's the contrast between the power of love versus the love of power. So to review, the following traits are characterized by the beast. It falsely claims the authority of God. It has an element of hypocrisy, and it uses coercion and fear. In other words, the spirit of Antichrist is the spirit of tyranny. It's a spirit of power and control. It's easy to recognize tyranny at high levels. You don't have to study history for long, but to see that there are tyrants in history. We can see tyrants and despots from a distance. They're very obvious when you look at a tyrant. You can tell that somebody is tyrannical. They run totalitarian countries with unquestioned authority. Their pompous words range from the magnificent to the ridiculous. In North Korea, for example, they actually teach that in schools that their leader created the world, which is pretty amazing. I didn't know that the leader of North Korea created the world. I don't know what happened before, the 1900s when the person was born, but also that he scored a hole-in-one in his very first game of golf, and that he doesn't need to use the bathroom. I'm not making this up. I wish I was, but that's the when someone elevates themselves to the level of God, it doesn't bottom out. There's no topping it out for ridiculousness. The possibilities are endless of just how stupid and foolish of things that they can come up with. Joseph Stalin is probably one of the best examples of a supreme, brutal dictator of the former Soviet Union. He was the first world leader to use Photoshop, actually, if you think about it, because he would edit people out of his photos when he unpersoned them. So if somebody had done something to embarrass him, he'd have them killed, and then he'd have all record of them existing would be erased. All public photos were edited, and they were, he had a photographer go and recreate it and blot them out so that they didn't exist. I mean, this is before computers even, took work to do this. Stalin and the communists systematically killed tens of millions of their own people. It started with the successful peasants, also known as the kulaks. They were scapegoated as bloodsuckers, leeching off the rest of society, exploiting their workers. So the communists started the dekulakization process, where the wealthy peasants were rounded up and sent to Siberia to die. So absurd was their reign of terror that they destroyed the lives of so many successful Russians that they began to run out of kulaks. So kulak was like a wealthy peasant. They ran out of them. So they had insane meetings where the government had quotas and they were running out of people to arrest. So they had to create new standards. That it didn't matter, they had to count how many cows you had. If you had this many cows, you were prosperous. So you were a kulak, and we had to throw you in prison for your crimes against your fellow man for being so much more prosperous. Then eventually they ran out of people with cows that were 3 cows, and they still had their quota. So they had to go, oh, well, if you have 1 cow, then you're a kulak, and we're going to arrest you. Then it didn't matter anymore if how many cows you owned. If you had sympathy for a kulak, you were a kulak sympathizer, and you were no better than a kulak, and you were thrown off into the prison system. So meanwhile, mass starvation resulted because when you take the best and brightest farmers that work in your communities and you arrest them and throw them into prison, and you say, oh, well, the government will run the farms. Turns out the government's not as good at running farms as the people who were the best at it already. It was estimated that 5 million people were killed as a result of this. And this was just one phase of it. Between 1917 and 1987, some estimate that there were 20 to 60 million people that were killed by their own government. And it was not enough. It wasn't enough for Stalin to destroy people's lives. He actually carefully wrote and edited people's confessions, and then would have them sign them. So he would write them himself, and he would edit. Oh no, this word sounds a little better, because then they would have a show trial where they would have a public trial where you were already guilty, and it was already determined that you're going to end up being thrown in prison, but they would, just go through the motions of this fake trial. It reminds me of a book by George Orwell, the book 1984. There's a dialogue between Winston, who's the main character, and a person named O'Brien, who's got him held captive. And O'Brien says, the real power, the power we have to fight for night and day, is not power over things, but over men. How does one man assert his power over another, Winston? And Winston said, by making him suffer. O'Brien said, power is inflicting pain and humiliation. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes a revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power. I think it just like fully encapsulates that kind of character of Satan. When I was young, I used to think that Satan wanted to oppose God because he thought that he could win. And it's more and more clear to me that Satan just wants to cause as much pain and havoc as possible. It's just evil for the sake of evil, suffering for the sake of suffering itself. So it's easy to see a tyrannical government. We can see that, but it didn't just appear out of thin air. How did a government like that become in power? One of my favorite speakers, Jordan Peterson, made a point that in the Soviet Union, the corruption, lying, hypocrisy, and betrayal at the highest levels of government went all the way down to the individual. Even the most conservative estimates estimate that 1 in 10 Russian citizens were secret spies for the government, that they would rat out their neighbor, they would rat out their friend, they would rat out their own family. There's an article about this, about a book by Orlando Figes, if I'm saying that right, who said one word from a resentful child was enough to send you to the firing squad. I mean, think about that. You know, your own children could turn you in and you'd be sent to a firing squad because there's a guy with a quota and he needs to find enough people to arrest, and he's going to arrest innocent people if he has to, and he's going to lie. So there's lying at the top and it goes all the way down to the bottom. So clearly a force as tyrannical as a beast power will not rise up just by political action or military strength. It's going to require support from people like you and me. We're going to have to buy into a system like that. So going back to our ability to pay attention, what could be the danger of identifying the beast, of knowing who the beast is? In so doing, we stop paying attention to others and we stop paying attention to ourselves. And maybe we could be acting like the beast ourselves and not realize it because we're like, well, that's the beast over there, not me for sure. I wouldn't support something like that. And it's kind of a naive argument, really, because like the vast majority of people in Russia supported it and went along with it. The same with the concentration camps and the Nazis in Germany. Like the vast majority of people were people just like you and me who started buying into it, started the lie, participated in the lie, and kept it going. So if you, for example, are operating under the three characteristics of the beast, that you have a kind of false authority, a hypocrisy, fear, coercion, what makes you think that you would oppose a system that's based on such things? Why wouldn't you be in support of it? Why wouldn't you be one of the people that were doing the killing and doing the persecuting? It's one of the most disturbing things that I read about the Rwanda genocide was that most of the killing took place in churches. People were lured into churches, and they said, oh, you'll be safe here, you'll be safe here. And then they slaughtered them with machetes. And there were some people in the churches who were doing the killing, and there were some people who were trying to smuggle people out and save them. And it didn't matter what denomination. It was, the Catholic Church, the Protestant churches, the Adventist churches, they were all in on it. I mean, over 300,000 people were killed in a very short time. It was 100 days of bloodshed. If you read about it, it's amazing how many people were killed. And the same thing happened. People were killing their own friends, their own family. I mean, can you imagine this church sanctuary being used for bloodshed? Luring people in and, we're going to have a meal for you because you're a member of the Tutsi tribe and you're these refugees. And we'll lure you in and then the doors are locked and they kill you. The bloodshed. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine, but I think we find it hard to imagine when we are not honest with ourselves and our own ability to be deceived, our own ability to follow things that we know deep down aren't good, but we don't speak up, we don't say anything about it because that's easier, it's more comfortable. So how do we operate out of fear and coercion? Paradoxically enough, I think we often begin with a false utopia that starts with an us versus them mentality, a very simplistic utopia, a perfect world in which we'll usher in a peaceful and perfect world. If only the people who ruin and mess everything up were dealt with and made to get with the program. Rather than submitting to the idea of God's utopia and looking instead to ourselves and how we need to get with the program, we look outward to others and we think, well, how can we bend them to the way we want? How can we make them fit our vision? Surely we're not the problem. It's all those people that are the problem. And that's where this kind of thinking starts. I'm sure you've probably heard a lot of husbands or wives say things like, well, I would be a better spouse if only my husband or wife wasn't so difficult, or wasn't so stupid, or wasn't so clumsy, or wasn't so ... There's a utopia. You just made yourself the god of a utopia there. That world will be perfect, and you'll be the god of that world. If only your poor, ridiculous peasant of a spouse would just open their eyes and see the light of how genius you are, and follow your utopia. So you're like a little god. And this happens in politics too. Not everyone that I talk to, but occasionally I'll have conversations with people who believe that we'll have a better world without Republicans, or a better world without Democrats. And I think, that's really funny, because half of the country is Republican and half of it is Democrat. So what are you going to do with the other half of people? You'll convince all of them? And if you don't convince them, what will you do? Will the one half see the light and convert to your other way of thinking? Because that's another utopia. I think one of the most fundamental ways we tyrannize each other on an individual level is in our marriages and our families. We try to make people like us. We try to change their fundamental nature. So what is our nature like? And what does it mean to tyrannize? I'm going to have to take a kind of a rabbit trail here, and so try to follow along. But in order to understand how we tyrannize people, we kind of have to understand how people are. So I became fascinated with studying personality ever since joining the church. I don't know if the older people in the church do this, but the younger people seem to be obsessed. There's like a subcult in the Adventist church of like studying personality. We'll like get together on a Sabbath afternoon, take personality tests, and talk to each other about them. It's kind of, I did that with all of my friends, and it was across different churches too. So I don't know if that's just a younger person thing or not, but I took tons of tests, and I was really, I know I'm going to catch a lot of flack for this, but I think most of them are hokum and are no more informative than a horoscope. That's just my opinion. But take it for what it's worth. I've read a lot about different tests, and one of them is my favorite because it's backed up by almost 40 years of psychometric data. So they've been studying it and testing it, and they've got computers and modeling and stuff that they can test it. And that's called the Big Five. The Big Five has a lot of data behind it. It's been studied since the 1980s, versus a lot of the personality tests that I think are hokum. They're from like the 1920s or before. They're really outdated. We didn't have a way to test things with computers. We didn't have a way to collect data in the way that we do now. But anyway, so Jonathan Haidt is a guy that I found out he said if you know somebody's Big Five scores, you can predict with 90% accuracy how they will vote. Isn't that fascinating? So if I had you take a Big Five test, I could look at your scores and I could be like, I bet you vote Democrat, or I bet you vote Republican. 90% is a really good indicator. Like, that's a really good predictor. If you could say, like, this will give you a 90% chance of knowing how somebody thinks about something. He found out, for example, if you were very orderly and you were low in openness, then you would more likely vote Republican. And if you were very high in openness and high in compassion, you would vote Democrat. I want to explain kind of what these things are. And of course, there are exceptions to everything. I've noticed that some people are either fascinated by this, or they're just up in arms and they get angry with me. They say like, absolutely not. I'm not like that. And I think like, well, I know you are kind of like that. But they are like really, they're like, no test defines me. I'm not defined by a number, and they get really, wound up about it. But anyway, so it spells out the word ocean. So O is for the trait for openness, which is a measure of your openness to ideas and your openness to experiences. We all know people who love trying new things. They love trying new foods. The weirder, the better. They've eaten things that you might wonder, what it even is, if it's snake skin or a bat wing or something like that. I had this mushroom in South Korea that I tried. It was, they served it as an appetizer. It was a black, scaly, like thin mushroom that they peel off of a rock. But it looks like snake skin or something because it's bumpy on one side, because that's the side that the rock comes off of. It was called soggy busset. But I remember thinking, like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever eaten. But I was like, let's try it. Let's see. First I had to text a picture of it and ask my friend, what the heck is this? But anyway, then there's also people who love ideas. They love going on rabbit trails. Every idea is a fair game to them. The world is a sandbox of ideas and conversations that we could have. And we also know people that are the opposite. They don't like to try new things. They never travel. Or if they do travel, they're really grumpy while they're traveling because things aren't familiar to them and they want things to be the same. And we also know people who see no value in talking about whether we have free will, whether the tree that falls in the forest, no one is there to hear it. What does it make a sound? Some people are like, what's the point of talking about that? It's useless. Do you know anyone like that? Like, why do you talk about that? It's pointless. And they just, when that kind of conversation goes up, they're just like, get me out of here. I don't want to talk about this pointless thing. So that's the trait for openness. The second one is trait conscientiousness, which is a measure of how orderly you are and how sensitive to disgust, and also your industriousness. So orderly people, they like things to stay where they are. Everything has a place and everything in its place. Isn't that nice? And they'll always say that kind of with a smile too. They will not only notice a messy room sooner, but they will be more disgusted by it. My friends, I don't know, you know Abby and Landon Smith, right? They're like the power couple. I always think they're so amazing how much they get done and they're so productive. But I asked them, I said, how long can you leave dirty dishes in a sink? And they're like, well, what do you mean how long? I was like, well, measured in like hours. And they're like, oh, not hours. Absolutely not. I was like, well, how long? Minutes maybe? Like, it's just, they're in the sink and it's disgusting. Like, just clean them up and wash them, I'm not like that. I don't know if you could gather that about me, but anyway, people that are low in orderliness, they're generally slobs. They're messy either because they don't notice or they do notice and they don't care. They see timeliness and schedules as restrictive. People that are industrious are very hardworking. It isn't so much that they love working, but that they really don't enjoy being unproductive. They say things like, I've wasted my day. I could have gotten so much more accomplished. They're very like self-punishing. They beat themselves up. They have a hard time forgiving themselves. So they order their lives and they organize their lives in a way that they won't fail. They won't disappoint themselves because they're hard on themselves. They really value willpower. When they see willpower, they're like, yeah, that's great. Whereas, people that are low in that trait might see people that have a lot of willpower and white knuckling it. They might see them as like a sucker or like a teacher's pet or something like that. So the people that are low and industrious, they don't value willpower. They enjoy their time off. When they fail, they blame circumstances or they blame luck. They're very easy on themselves. They forgive themselves easily. Like, I ate the whole thing of Oreos. Well, I had a hard day. And they'll just sort of pat themselves on the back more easily. So that's the second trait, is conscientiousness. The third is extroversion, which is a measure of how enthusiastic you are and how assertive you are. So enthusiastic people, they have a lot of energy. They love interacting. They have a hard time keeping secrets because they want to tell everyone everything. An extremely extroverted person will get back from a party and could probably go right back out to another party. Assertiveness is a measure of how often you might act first and you might ask questions later. You like to take charge. You're the kind of person who's the first person to volunteer to do something. And introverts, on the other hand, they tend to be more reserved. We've probably heard these terms before, but social interaction wears them out. You probably have a spouse or a friend or family member that after a big old party or big hoopla, they're like, oh, I just need to go home. And they say things like, that was fun, but I'm really glad it's over. Whereas an extrovert says, that was so much fun. When's it going to happen again? And they're just really excited to go out and do it again. So on a side note, I read something really funny about introverts that made me feel kind of dumb. So I don't know if you're an extrovert, this is going to make you feel kind of dumb. But apparently, introverts have a very high level of brain activity. So by the time they say something, they've already thought about it a lot. Whereas extroverts have very low brain activity, apparently. And often, if you ask an extrovert what they think, they have to talk about it before they don't just spend a bunch of time alone thinking. They actually will use other people to bounce their ideas off of. It's like their ideas are not in their head, their ideas are out there. and they sort of like, they need a sounding board or an audience to just kind of bounce them off of each other. So that made me feel kind of dumb. But anyway, extroversion is also a measure of positive emotion, sensitivity to positive emotion. So when there's like a big party, lots of exciting stuff, an extrovert's like, ooh, like, yeah, let's do that. Whereas an introvert's like, is there any excuse we can use to get out of this? Do we have to? So the fourth trait, I want to give you kind of an understanding about people, like what are we like in general? Then you'll see kind of the ways we tyrannize each other. The fourth one is agreeableness, and this is a measure of how compassionate you are and how polite you are. Compassionate people, they have a very other-oriented view of the world. It's sometimes hard for them to answer the question, what do you want, on a personal level? Because what they want is for everyone to be happy. They complain about things like fairness. They don't like making other people unhappy. They're generally all polite as well. Politeness is a measure of how much you'd rather go along to get along, how much you respect and defer to authority, how much you restrain your own opinion for the sake of not offending other people and rocking the boat. And this is really a tough one because agreeable people, they sound like such caring people, but the trouble is they often struggle with resentment and bitterness because they're giving to everyone else. And then they kind of assume, well, the world will just get back to me. And then it doesn't. And then you get bitter and resentful and you feel, annoyed by it. Agreeableness is, it's also associated with low pay because they're not very good at arguing on their own behalf. Like an agreeable person will be a great customer service agent, a great doctor or nurse. They will fight for other people, but they won't necessarily fight for themselves. You probably know someone like this or you are someone like this. If you have to split something down the middle, you'd much rather it be like 60-40 than 50-50. 50-50 feels kind of wrong and greedy. Well, I don't need half. I could just take like 30. I'll take 30, you take 70. So like when I work as a sales agent and sometimes we split commissions and some of the more agreeable people in the office are kind of a pushover and I know that about them. So they'll say like, well, just cut me in 30-70. That's fine. And I can already tell like, you did a lot more work than 30%. Like I'll just cut it. I don't even ask them anymore. I'll just cut them 50-50 and they don't like that. But you almost will never get an agreeable person to fight for themselves to the same degree that a disagreeable person would be. Disagreeable people are able to separate themselves from the emotions of others. So they make great managers because they're not afraid of upsetting people. Managers have to fire people. That's the kind of idea that makes me sick. I would hate to have to fire someone, but a disagreeable person can separate, that's your problem, this is my problem, I need to do what's right for the company, time for you to go home, and then on you go. Being low in agreeableness can also be associated with higher pay, managerial positions, being a lawyer, but also being an inmate or being in trouble with the law. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. I sometimes wonder if the people in the prison system had better resources growing up, that maybe they might be lawyers, or because if you've met I don't know how many of you know a lawyer. Does anyone here know a lawyer that you're friends with? No? No one in here? Not a single person in here is friends with a lawyer? Do you know why that is? Because they don't value relationships and they're busy working. That's probably why it is. You know someone? Okay, so there's one person in here is friends with a lawyer. So, they're very driven people. They're very busy and they're not going to let somebody else distract them. So you just have to talk to a lawyer for 5 minutes and they can already get you to think of all the horrible things people will do to you and how you need to get to them before they get to you. And it's really, I've talked to one before. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're scaring me. But anyway, the last trait is neuroticism. And neuroticism is a measure of how sensitive you are to negative emotions. So people that are high in withdrawal, they're more likely to anticipate. So it's basically two things. It's withdrawal and it's volatility. People that are high in withdrawal, they're more likely to worry about bad things happening. They're more likely to be depressed. They also have a more accurate appraisal of their relationships. People that are high in volatility tend to have a short fuse. They have tempers and they don't worry about bad things happening, but when they do, they are not happy about it. So those are two different aspects of negative emotion. So you could be low in neuroticism. You think that would be a good thing, right? Like, well, negative emotion, that's always a bad thing. That's what I thought. I was like, well, it's always bad. But then I found out apparently serial killers are usually really low in neuroticism. To be too much on an even keel. Isn't that kind of fascinating? That there could be a bad thing about not feeling bad. Like you need to have some amount of like, ooh, this could be bad. So apparently that's why we don't kill each other. But anyway, so I'm going to say something that's, so I'm going to get back to the tyrannizing thing. And I'm going to say something that's probably going to be really upsetting to you. It will either really upset you or it will be very liberating to you. But I'll give some clarifications and qualifications after I make my offensive statement. So, because I think some of you are going to think that you're going to refuse what I'm going to say, and you might think that I'm letting people off the hook for bad behavior or something like that. But here's the statement, is that our personalities are largely stable. They don't change much over time. And so a lot of people might, and I don't know why some people think that that's a bad thing, other than maybe you don't like yourself, and so you think you ought to be different than the way you are when God made you, the way you are as a child, because our parents have some influence on it, but by the time we're 4 or 5 years old, like our personality is pretty much set. That once you're outgoing, you're an outgoing person. Now, if you were an introvert, you could probably learn how to be more outgoing. You could learn how to do that, but you're probably still not going to like it. You're probably still going to need to go home and recuperate after something like this. I could probably get done speaking here and go to another church and do the same sermon over again, and then do the same thing over again. Like I remember one time I was teaching in a semester, I had 3 of the same classes back to back to back, and I had a 10-minute window between all of them, and I could have done it like 3 more hours. So, but the difference is you can learn behaviors, but you can't necessarily learn other things. Neuroticism is something that's really helpful to know about if you're not neurotic. So I tend to have a bit of a temper, but I'm very low in withdrawal. So I've never really experienced depression or anxiety in the way that other people do. So for example, when I was married, I would come home and I would say things like, "Man, I read this horrible article about a woman that killed her children. She choked her toddlers to death or something." And my wife at the time would be really bummed out for like the whole day. Whereas I would be like really bummed out for about an hour, and I get over it and be able to move on with my day. So people that are more sensitive to negative emotions, they might be like, it takes a lot out of them to hear negative things, to experience negative things. I had to learn that some people are easily bummed out, and I have to be careful about what I talk about with them. Not that they're like a China doll or that they're weak, but that you got to bear with people. So anyway, I want to pick on myself a little bit. So like I said, I have a temper, and I've learned how to manage it, but that doesn't make my feeling of anger go away. I still have like intense feelings of anger, which is really funny. I remember this one time. This is after I'd done a lot of work in controlling my temper and everything. Tried to verbalize my anger instead of letting it bottle up inside. I remember I was cleaning up little bits and pieces of paper from a craft. And I hate crafts. I don't know. Are there any other parents in here who like hate arts and crafts? I really like art when it's not little papers that like they're snipped up and stuff. The little papers they fall off the table and then they like fall on the floor and they just sort of like lay flat on the floor perfectly. You can't sweep them. You have to like get down on your hands and knees and like peel them off the floor, especially if it's really humid. It just drives me absolutely nuts when I see little pieces of paper everywhere. So I'm for whatever reason, and I'm a really messy person. I'm really, messy. If you saw my bedroom or my desk at work, you'd probably be really ashamed of me. But I'm not a very organized person. So, but for whatever reason, little bits of paper they just hit the sweet spot for me. They're so irritating. And I was picking them up bit by bit because it's also not something that you can have your kids pick up. A lot of times people are like, well, have your kids clean up their own mess. It's like, I don't want to wait 2.5 hours for my kids to like peel these little pieces of paper. Kids aren't as coordinated and it might take a long time. If it was something they could do, like Legos, I could, pick up your Legos or whatever. So I'm on my hands and knees picking these little pieces up. And I said, cleaning up these little bits of paper fills me with rage. And I said that, and my wife at the time was like, really? Rage? Is that the right word you'd use? I'm like, yes. That is exactly the right word. I feel full of rage right now over these little bits of paper. So anyway, so we can change our outward behavior and we can learn how to verbalize. We can learn how to use our words, but ultimately we're not going to change who we are and those kind of things. And you might wonder, well, what's the value of volatility? I remember, I don't know how many of you were there, but my son was drowning at a pond. We were at a church gathering, and a lot of the adults, turned. It was almost they were in slow motion, seeing my son drown. They're like, oh, he's struggling. And whereas I saw it and I recognized in a split second, and within seconds I was flipping things out of my pockets and running into the water like a crazy person. And I think sometimes the ability to snap is maybe a good thing, whereas if you're really mellow and, hunky-dory, nope, I'm going to get over there. But anyway, so some of you might really not like that idea that we can't really change our personality. But the reality, the evidence shows it's actually extremely difficult to change it. So what does all this have to do with tyranny? Getting back to tyranny. And I know some of the people that are not super creative types probably really irritated with me and my rabbit trailing. But anyway, the reality is God made each of us a certain way. And we need each other. So some of us are dreamers, and some of us are visionaries. We think outside the box. We're very creative. It's one of the signs of being an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs are very high in trait openness if you have them take a Big Five test. They're very high in openness. A person like Steve Jobs might start a company, but the trouble with creative people is they're often not very good at being organized and getting things done. They're very scatterbrained and forgetful, and because they're always thinking of things all the time. I don't know if any of you have this problem where you're driving down the road and you might see a horse in the field, and you go, oh, there's a horse in the field. Oh, that's such a beautiful horse. Oh, I remember you're supposed to swerve if you see a horse in the road. I wonder why that is. Maybe because if I hit the horse dead on, its legs would kick out and they would roll in. I'm thinking of all these things, and then I'm thinking, I wonder how would I avoid that if I did hit a horse on the road? What would I do? And all these thoughts are running through my head, and I was talking to somebody about it, and they were like, I never think things like that, but I'm thinking things like that all the time. And that's the trouble with being creative, is that you can't turn that off. You're always thinking all the time. And it's not even I wish I could say it was something I could take credit for, but it always seems to be ideas will just come to me. So we need dreamers, but we also need people who will run things. Because the people who can run things are very good at organizing. They maybe aren't creative, but they're very good at keeping a machine going. But over time, if you replace a company with too many of those people, now it becomes stagnant, and then it doesn't survive. Eventually, the non-creative types will even vote the dreamer out. They'll be just like Joseph's brothers. In Genesis 37:19, they say, "Here comes that dreamer," and they get rid of the dreamer. And that actually happened to Steve Jobs. His own company voted him out. So he was the one who started it, and then his own company turned on him and got rid of him because his ideas were too crazy or whatever. Then they call him back. That just blows my mind. I'll give you another example. Mattel said that one toy line would never work. The upper management of Hasbro actually looked at the toy, and when the CEO saw it, he said, "That's the dumbest idea I've ever seen." Can you guess what toy that was? My kids already know because we watched a documentary about it together. The Ninja Turtles. So he said, "That's the dumbest idea I've ever seen." There's a bunch of big companies passed on it. Big established companies with a long track record. Fast forward 20 years, and Viacom bought Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for $60 million. So that was a bad bet that Mattel made. There was a really bad bet that Hasbro made. So we need... Now Hasbro has managed to survive. Mattel is really struggling. Like the toy company Mattel that makes Barbies and stuff, they're really struggling. So we need managers. We need the people who are more low in openness. They're not creative types, but they're very good at being practically minded and thinking about the here and now. But we also need dreamers. This goes all across all across everything. Should we open our borders or should we close our borders? The answer to that is yes. It's a contradiction. We need people to have a conversation with each other that are different from each other, that don't think like each other. The idea that we will somehow arrive in an era on earth where there aren't any conservatives or there aren't any liberals, it's just a fantasy. We'll always have people who are the out-of-the-box thinkers, the people who are very compassionate, who are concerned about little people. We'll always have people who are not very creative. They're not open to new things. They like things to stay the same, and they're very organized and very industrious. We'll always have those types of people. There's really not anything we can do to change that. But it's a fantasy. And it's a fantasy that it's reared its ugly head in Auschwitz. It's reared its ugly head in the gulags of Russia, and it's reared its ugly head in Rwanda. It produces tribalism and death. And people don't want to live in a world where everyone is the same, and they will fight to escape it. So, for example, I don't know how many of you know about do you know about the Vietnamese boat people? So after the Vietnam War and after the communists took over, some people tried to escape, and they just made boats out of whatever they could, and they went into the Pacific Ocean. Over 1 million people. 800,000 of them survived, but 200,000 to 400,000 died in the Pacific Ocean. And I mean, do you think about the human spirit and wanting freedom? No one wants to be put in a position where you have no freedom and you are forced to be like everyone else. God made us different, but we try to tyrannize each other. It happens all the time in marriages. You may have heard the advice, don't try to change each other. That's like the warning on the iron that says, don't iron while it's on your body. Right? There's a warning on irons like that. Don't iron while on your body. Why do you think a warning like that exists? Because somebody that's in a hurry, oh, my sleeve's a little, oh, I've got a 2nd-degree burn on my arm now, The warning is there because people have tried to do it. We don't, and the funny thing is, we usually don't like people that are like us, or we butt heads with them when the person is exactly like us. So it's funny, in marriages, you'll see people try to change the spouse to be like them, but they don't like the people that are exactly like them, And it's funny, when I think about the women that I've been interested in or not interested in, the ones who are the most extroverted were usually the most repulsive to me. Like, I just felt like, you're just like boring, you're just like, everything's out there. And, and that's how I am. I don't share, I share almost everything. It's hard for me to keep secrets, but also maybe it's a limelight thing. Like, I don't want to share the stage with another extrovert. That might be why. Introverts are so interesting to me. They're such interesting people because they're so quiet and they're reserved and they're thinking a lot. But anyway, so, it's funny when we're dating someone, the things that make them different are what we love about them. And we fall in love with someone because they're different. But then over time, so when we first meet them, the introverted person says, wow, he talks so much and he seems to know everyone. And then 5 years later, do you have to talk to everyone? You're always talking, blah, 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 blah. So you meet a creative person and you're amazed by their art, but then the downside is that they're messy. And a lot of artists already know this, if there are any artists in here. The creative process is a messy one, and the creative space is often littered with crumpled up papers, paint containers, things are half in varying stages of completion, sandpaper, and it's like this for days. And then some of the most beautiful artwork emerges from the chaos of the creative process. And you wouldn't be able to do that if you were neatly packing everything up into boxes and cleaning your workspace every single hour. Like, oh, I'm done here. Okay, pack everything away. Sometimes you have to let things simmer. So So, and then if you may meet an introverted person, and they may seem so thoughtful and concise, but then later you learn that they never want to do anything that's not at their house. I don't know if you probably have friends like that you could probably always go over to their house, but they're probably never going to come over to your house. And it's funny because as an extrovert, I've had to learn how to be sensitive to introverts. But I want to pick on introverts a little bit. Sometimes you're a stick in the mud, and it's difficult when somebody's a stick in the mud, So, but that's a challenge that we have in our marriages and in our close friendships is, how do you respect the person for who they are and work with them without trying to demonize them for being different than you. They don't think like you. They're wired differently. Social interaction actually does wear them out. I remember in my early years, I remember whenever I had a party, I always wanted to have as many people there as possible. Invite like 15, 20 people. And sometimes like, a dozen would show up. And that's very fun and exciting, but it took a lot of convincing from an introvert to get me to see that's it ends up being very shallow. You don't end up talking to the other people there. And also, you will wear your spouse out, who is a more introverted person, if you're constantly doing things like that and constantly dragging them along to all these like social events. You'll wear them out because it's wearing on them, So we can tyrannize each other in marriages and trying to make people like ourselves, and do things that harm each other. Another thing I think about it is with children. Some children, I remember when I was a first parent, I thought, wow, I'm such a good parent because my son does exactly what I tell him all the time. And this is great. I'm such a good dad, and I'm not like those other parents, and they're, terrible children that don't listen and are stubborn and whatever. I'm better than those parents. But then I had my second son, and he really gave me a run for my money because Sammy's he's more of a strong-willed kid, and I love that about him. But it comes with its challenges, and that's the trouble with personality is that none of it will be without its challenges. No matter who you are, if you're more agreeable, it's nice that you love to make other people happy, but then you also struggle with bitterness and resentment. With being strong-willed, yeah, you know what you want and you go after what you want, but you're also difficult to work with when you can't be convinced to do something that is out of your wheelhouse. I think I mentioned this before, but I read this by a psychologist and I thought it was fascinating. They said that parents ought to regard themselves as a loaded gun when they're dealing with their children, because the capacity for you to be able to destroy your children is great. You could really destroy your children very easily. I remember when I was a kid, and I've talked about to my mom about this, and we've kind of patched it over. But I remember when I was really little, I learned how to play piano. It was Jingle Bells, and I played Jingle Bells on the piano, and I was like singing as loud as I possibly could. And me, she's very extroverted, speaks quickly without necessarily thinking about what she's about to say. Everything is out in the open with my mom. You never not know what my mom's thinking, and I love my mom for that. Like I said, I'm very similar to her. But anyway, she said. I played it and I was a little off on the keys, and some of them were sharp and some of them were flat, and she just started laughing and she said, "Oh, Billy, don't quit your day job." And I was like, "What does that mean, Mommy?" And she said, "It means you're not a good singer. You probably shouldn't sing." And I didn't sing again for over 10 years. It wasn't until I was 18 years old. That was like when I was 7 or 8 years old, and I didn't sing again for 10 years. So the capacity that we have to just go with our inclinations for what we're naturally inclined to. And that's sort of the big paradox. So we can't force people to be like us, but we also can't just be like us all the time. You know what I'm saying? It's a difficult challenge. So we have the satanic route, which is bend and manipulate and force and coerce people to bend them to be the way we want them to be. And then we have the path that Christ took. And so I want to share a little bit about that because it's very easy. I read something about parenting, and they said if your children turn out different, that's different from each other, that's a good sign. That means you've allowed them to be who they are. Whereas if all your children turn out roughly the same, that means you've kind of crushed the differences out of them, and you've made them, you've push them to be like the way that you want them to be, not necessarily who they are as a little unique, special person that they are. So, I'll tell my own story. I know that for years I worked as a teacher. As I've already said, I'm very extroverted. I really enjoy speaking. and also I care about other people. I took the Big Five test and I scored really high in compassion. So I really enjoy making other people happy. That like, I live for that. If somebody was like, Bill, that was really helpful. Thank you for that help. I'm always like, oh yes, yeah, I did it. That I live for that. And that's pretty much the only way that you could be a teacher, because it's such a miserable, thankless job with long hours. And I remember at one point I had like a big stack of papers. It took me 60 hours to grind through them. And for the longest time, I tyrannized myself. I'm not very good at working if I know the work is on some level pointless. So with grading, I had 60 hours of unpaid grading, getting through the stack of papers, and the vast majority of students did nothing with my comments. Like out of 20 students, how many do you think revised and did anything with my comments? Yeah, like 1 or 2. It was always like 1 or 2. So like there was 60 hours of drudgery, and at the other end of it, I knew one person was going to use it. Maybe 2 people were going to use it. Now, for people that are high in trait conscientiousness, they're very industrious. They don't like not being productive. I had a coworker, her name was Diana. It was fascinating. She said, I just do 10 a day, and I just make sure I do my 10 a day. And she just, burn through them. And she's also kind of person like she retired, and now she's like busier than she was when she was working. These kind of people like you. My brother is like this, and I joke with other people. I say I could drop my brother in a forest with an axe, and he would probably start logging. Like if that's all he had was an axe, and he's in a forest alone, he would do something. He would do something to be productive. So for a person like that job wouldn't be as difficult. But I spent 10 years trying to make myself not be the way that I am. Like, oh, I'm too distracted. I need to do this. I'm no good. I shouldn't be in this I shouldn't be having this hard time. You can force yourself to go through things that are actually, they're very destructive, and maybe it's not the best fit for you. Maybe there's a job out there that's better, that your traits would be better suited for. But I think about the years I spent teaching. It was like, yeah, I'm good at teaching, but the grading is the majority of the work that you do. So if you're not a very industrious person, that's going to be, like going through hell every single semester. You're going to have giant stacks of paper, and you just have to keep going. And for the people that are more wired that way, they wouldn't even be questioning like, is this worthwhile? Because the important thing is to be busy and productive. That's how some people are wired. So I spent a lot of time doing that. And so I want you to turn with me to Philippians 2, 5 through 8. This is one of my favorite texts, and there's also kind of a paradox here as well. And I'm going to close with this story. So Philippians 2, 5 through 8, it says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon himself the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross." And if you continue on, it says, "Wherefore God has also highly exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven, and things in earth, and things under the earth." So it's like a paradox. So Jesus becomes nothing. That word, made himself of no reputation, the Greek word is kenosis. It means to empty yourself. So Jesus emptied everything that he had, and he had ultimate power. Some of us think like, when we think of power, we think like, I'll say this really mean thing, and that'll really grind their gears. I'll really get to them. It's like Jesus could call down a legion of angels to vaporize someone. That's power. Like when you look at what we are able to do, like, yeah, I'll really hurt their feelings, or I'll do this thing. It's really kind of pathetic. We don't really have very much power to give up. Jesus had ultimate power, but he willingly gave that up, and somehow in doing so, his name is highly exalted. Whereas Satan did everything he could to gain power but he will be laid low in the end. It's like the very opposite thing will happen. And I want to talk to you about the way that I used to read this before I learned more about personality. I would read passages like this, and I remember in the Sabbath School Quarterly, I think even a couple weeks ago, there was a line in there. It was a question that said, considering this passage, I don't know if you remember it or not, but it says, considering this passage, what is more that you could do for the kingdom of God? And I thought to myself, that is a really dangerous question to ask an agreeable person. An agreeable person will read that and they'll say, oh, yes, I need to do more. I need to give more. I need to do more of what people want of me. I need to say yes more. And I think the part of emptying yourself is emptying what your inclinations are. Maybe you're inclined to be a certain way. Maybe there's a way that comes naturally to you. And rather than go with what you're inclined to do, maybe Christ is calling you to not do that, or to do something different. You know, like I have a friend that he's a really, really close friend of mine, and I remember one time we got in an argument, and he said something like, "You don't really care anything about what's going on in my life. You know, you're so occupied with your own thoughts and your own problems or whatever." And that really stuck with me because it hurt, because it's not how I felt. But I could see why he thought that, because whenever I called him, it was always I was going through a difficult time, so I was calling him. And whenever I needed somebody to talk to, I was always, talking to him about my problems, and it was always just me. And that's an easy trap to get in as an extrovert, because extroverts are notoriously bad listeners, because we're really good at talking, so we just fill the space with our own thoughts. So I made like that really stuck with me. I thought, okay, I'm inclined today to call him to talk about something that I'm really bothered about. I want to talk to him about that. But then I was like, it's been a long time since I asked him any questions about what's going on in his life. And so I made it a point to talk to him about that. And then it was like, and he's more introverted too. So, and he just like opened up like about all these things he was going through. And I thought like, wow, this is, I don't often like hear him talk at length like this, And then the next time I talked to him, I was interested. I was thinking, well, I wonder how that job interview went. I wonder how this went. So I'd call him, hey, how was that job interview? Did you get the job? Well, we're in the second stage now. And I was excited to hear good news, for him. But it just so when it talks about Christ emptied himself, sometimes the right thing is to empty yourself of like what you might already be inclined to do. Just because you're inclined to do it does not make it right. Just because you like to do what other people want, you like to make other people happy, that does not make that right. There are times that might be toxic. Like there's for example, and I don't want to step on any toes here, because I don't know a lot of your living arrangements here, but a mother who has their son still living at home. Think about the kind of, it comes out of a place of compassion. I want to take care of you. But at the bottom of that, compassion has a dark side too. There's ways we can help someone so much that they don't launch. They don't take off on their own. They don't go out into the world and suffer like they need to in order to be an adult. So sometimes we might be inclined to be compassionate, but that compassion has a dark side. The same with being orderly. Like we might really want things to be structured in such a way, and they have to be structured. I don't want to demonize anyone. I think the way that you're wired, that's the way that seems most natural to you. It's the way that seems most normal. But I remember, I don't want to embarrass anyone. Let's just say that there was silly string involved. I bought some silly string for some kids, and then they they made everybody wear a poncho with a garbage bag, with their head popped out, and like, oh, we don't want them to stain their clothes. I was thinking, yeah, some things are more important than clothes, like having fun with silly string, just going nuts, and that's going to be the constant tension between people that are orderly and people that aren't. There's a tension that's going to exist between them, and the key is to be in harmony, love one another, empty yourself of what you're inclined to do, and operate from a position of strength. Jesus operated from a position of strength. He did not have to come down and die. He did not have to come down here and deal with this. He did not have to take responsibility for it, but he did. So he's operating out of a position of strength. He definitely wasn't up in heaven going, oh, I hope they like me, and if I don't go down there, they won't like me, and do all those other things. These are the kind of things that agreeable people struggle with. I've struggled with it for years, wanting people to like me, wanting people to approve of me. And that comes really natural to an agreeable person. But just because it comes naturally to you does not make it right. You have to check yourself. It's a strange paradox, and it's not something I've fully figured out. When do you be who you are, and when do you resist that and restrain yourself from doing what's already natural? Which might not be wrong. I'm not talking about sin here or bad behavior. Obviously, if you're tempted to steal something, don't do that. If you're tempted to break Sabbath, don't do that. If we only go with what we're inclined to do, we're going to miss the boat sometimes, and we may hurt each other. And also we can't change ourselves. It's like I said, it's a paradox. We have to be sensitive that we're not becoming a tyrant to each other, and also that we're not becoming a tyrant to ourselves and trying to force ourselves to be what we're not. If you need to retreat and recharge, and your family might be sad, especially your extroverted spouse. They're always going to be sad, like, oh, you're not here, I lost my buddy, or whatever. But maybe they need that, and you should respect that they want that kind of space to themselves. I think about some of my married friends, and you'll know who you are, if they're listening. I don't know if they're listening or not. But I have some married friends where they're and this is going to sound like an absurdly silly idea, but their wives don't let them hang out with their friends. I think that's always such a bad sign. It's a bad sign. So you're not going to let them, like, what are they, a child? Are you an equal? Are you able to operate on an equal level with each other, or is there sort of I'm going to control what you do, and no, you're not going to do that, and if you do, I'm going to withhold love from you, or I'm going to threaten you, or I'm going to do this or that, just as an outside observer. So I guess in closing, I want to encourage you to be who you are, but also to step out in faith, and to try to become more aware of who you are, how God wired you, that God actually made you for a special purpose. There's a reason God made you exactly the way that you are, wired the way that you are. And sometimes that might mean that the ways that you are inclined bring something special to the world. And that's something I wish people could be encouraged by more often, that the world would be a poorer world without Nathan. The world would be a poorer world without Aaron. That sometimes we can get so down on ourselves that we feel like, yeah, it'd be better off if I were gone. But the world would be poorer without you. I've yet to go to a funeral where people weren't sad that the person was gone. Even the people that were suicides I've been to several suicide funerals. It's one of the most depressing things because the person, said, nobody loves me. I'm never going to find someone, blah, blah, blah. And then they, their whole family loved them, and they're weeping for them, and there's so much, you can tell from the stories that the family has that they had so much love for that person. So yeah, we have to be ourselves. We can't hate ourselves the way that God has wired us, but if you're more of an extroverted person, go out there and speak, encourage people, be the first to go out and encourage. But at the same time, you have to, do what Christ did and empty yourself. And so we'll stop there. So I hope that we can do that. And so I'll let's close with prayer. If you bow your heads with me. Our Father in heaven, I thank you so much for making us the way that you've made us. I thank you so much that we have different people. We have some people in here who are very timely and orderly. We have people in here who are more creative, the more creative types. We have people that are both. We have people that are very compassionate and care for others very deeply. We have other people that are able to stay focused and not let other people's opinions deter them so easily. And I thank you that we have people that are sensitive to negative things and people that are not. And that, Lord, you've brought us here to learn from each other and to be kind and be compassionate to each other. And I pray that you would help us to follow the example of Christ, and that we would manifest that character of Jesus in Philippians chapter 2. That we would empty ourselves, and I pray that you'd help us to be in harmony with one another. In the name of Jesus, amen.